It's
Hmm.
not leadership based on the individual, but based on a system. Do you
Right.
mind talking about that for a moment?
Oh, I love talking about that. And you know, how many days do we have to talk about it? I spent 4 years researching it and writing about it, so it's a bit of an obsession. But yeah, when I began asking the question, how do high impact organizations, you might even say elite level organizations, how do they approach the practice of leadership? They do not approach it as a style of the individual. They approach it very systemically. Um, the analogy that I use in the book is they essentially create their own organizational DNA, and they do that with intention. Um, just as an example, one of my interviews was with a retired four-star general of the United States Army. And when I asked him, I said, "How does the Army approach the practice of leadership?" He said, "We practice servant leadership." And that idea comes with it a whole set of values, a whole set of well-defined behaviors. When I asked him, "How does the Army teach, train, and support and implement the practice of servant leadership?" He didn't give me, half a dozen attributes of the servant leader. He gave me three attributes of the way the Army reinforces servant leadership, and I'll give you one. Um, the When a company or when a group, a platoon is getting on a helicopter to go out on a mission, who is the last person to get on that helicopter? Happens to be the highest ranking officer, because that in effect says my job is to protect my soldiers. I'm going to get on this helicopter last. And who gets off of that helicopter first? It's the highest ranking officer, symbolically saying I'm going to put myself in harm's way first, because one of my number one jobs as a servant leader is to protect my soldiers. And yeah, that might say, well, it's largely symbolic, and yeah, I don't think there's anybody that would disagree with that. But it's one very, very simple way that the Army teaches its officers, your primary job is to protect and serve your soldiers. And he gave me just one other real simple example, and that's in the cafeteria when everybody's getting their lunch. Who goes last? Who goes through the cafeteria line last? Well, it happens to be the highest ranking officer. Again, representing the idea that as an officer, your primary duty is to protect and defend and take care of your soldiers.
Hmm. How do you think, what's, in your opinion, the best way to go about translating that into a, well, for lack of a better term, corporate
Sure,
environment?
sure. Well, as it turns out, the United States Army isn't the only organization that practices servant leadership. There's a few others like Coca-Cola, Google, Starbucks, intentionally practice servant leadership. And basically, they say, as a leader in this organization, your job is to really look out for and take care of the needs of your employees, of your staff. So one of the healthcare organizations I looked at was an organization down in Mississippi, way in the south of the U.S. And they intentionally designed a system of leadership around the principles of servant leadership. And so one of the routines that they set up was every leader was to round to their employees or their team every day. Now, rounding is a term that comes out of healthcare. It's the idea that when hospitals, or when physicians, they go and visit their patients in the hospital, they round to their patients. So rounding is just an idea that comes out of the healthcare industry that says if you're a leader, you go to your employees and you basically visit with them. It's management by walking around. In the lean world, the Toyota production system world, we might call that a Gemba. It's the exact same concept. But this healthcare organization in Mississippi, the CEO said to all of his leaders, your number one priority is to round to your team every day. And that is the number one priority of your schedule. Everything else in your calendar and your schedule is secondary to that activity. And you're to visit with him. In fact, the joke about him, and he was running 4 different hospitals, 30 some clinics, 7,000 employees. The joke about him was if you needed to see him, don't bother going to his office because he's never there. He's always out with his people. And he even had a practice of he would never eat lunch by himself. He always ate lunch in one of the cafeterias with everybody else, because as he said to me, he said I could learn more about what was going on in the various hospitals and clinics in a half hour sitting with the rank and file eating lunch than I ever could in a staff meeting. And but he made rounding the priority, and required every one of his leaders to do the same. And would anybody be surprised that the engagement levels of his employees, which is basically a measure of how emotionally and psychologically they are engaged with the organization, was in the 96th percentile. And it wasn't that there for a month or two, it was there for 3 years prior to probably 5 years prior to him leaving. That is a massive accomplishment. And patient satisfaction scores are in the 90th percentile nationally, which again is a massive, massive accomplishment. So, he set up this system of servant leadership, and it wasn't anything that was difficult and hard. It was basically centered around things like you visit with your team. Um, I had one of my early conversations was with the chief medical officer of a large trauma center. He would never admit this, but he'd be classified as one of the top trauma specialists in the States. And I was talking to him about leadership and how I'm looking at leadership as a system. And he said, well, let me tell you a story. He said, our hospital had a few years ago a CEO who operated out of the 12th floor of the hospital. He said, I'm one of his senior leaders. He said, I never saw her. He said, I would see her in official meetings. Most of the communication was through email, and the joke in the trauma center was, the 12th floor wants to see you, or the 12th floor is asking us to do this, that, or the other thing. It was never about a person. It was always just the 12th floor. And, he said, I'm one of his, I was one of her senior leaders. And, outside of official meetings, never had a conversation with her. He said, then we get a new CEO. And he moves his office from the 12th floor to the first floor, right in back of the admitting office of the hospital, just so he can see what was going on with the people coming in, being admitted, get a sense of the pulse and the rhythm of the hospital. And Steve, the chief medical officer, said the strange thing is when he showed up in my office one day, and he just walked into the trauma center and just wanted to see what was going on. He said that was shocking enough. Then he came back, and since he's been here, which has been 2 or 3 years, he said he comes around every 2 or 3 times a week just to see how things are going on. And as he puts it, he says, names turn into faces, relationships that get established. And he said the strange thing is, where before there was no basis for trust of senior leadership because nobody knew who they were, all of a sudden there's enormous trust being built for our senior leadership. The engagement of my staff is going through the roof just because the CEO decides to show up and see how things are going along.
Well, it makes me think of the typical. I'm not sure if you've heard the term or not, but lock yourself away in the ivory tower type thing. It's sort
Yep.
of like, would you say it's one of the main mistakes of leadership?
Oh, massively so. Um, I'll give you another story. It's one of the nation's safest hospitals. It's been credited with one of the nation as one of the nation's safest hospitals for I think like the last 9 years. And actually, someone from the UK uh, took a tour and proclaimed it to be the safest hospital in the world, which doesn't sound like any real big deal until you realize that avoidable deaths in hospitals is one of the leading causes of death in America.
Mm.
I think the last number was 161,000 people die a year because of avoidable accidents in hospitals. So a safe hospital is a big deal.
Mm.
And this is a hospital. I know where it's at. It sits on a hill. There could be, probably is, I know there is, from many of the floors, a beautiful, expansive view of the city, of a harbor, snow-capped mountains. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous city. And their offices for their executive leadership team is in the basement. And that's by intention. They want to leave because this hospital is driven off of a single core value of respect. Respect for the patient, respect for the work, respect for the worker. So if you're designing a hospital based on a culture, a core value of respect, where do you put the executive offices? Do you put them up on the top floor where they have the big expansive views of the city? Or do you leave those views for the patients because you're driven off of a value of respecting the patient? No, you put them in the basement because they also recognize that the best work that leaders do is when they're not sitting in their offices.
It's like an incentive.
I could
I
use,
have to
I
get
could
out
use
of
some,
this place.
yeah, well, yeah, and I could. It'd be fun to use some stronger language, but get your rear out of the seat of your executive office chair and go hang out with your team once in a while.